The war ended 12 years ago, but for me it never really stopped. The guns quieted, the uniforms came off, the medals were boxed away, yet the noise inside my head never went silent. In the evenings, when the rest of the neighborhood drifted into the easy calm of television laughter, I would sit in the back room of our house in Worcester staring at a table covered in wires, vacuum tubes, and half-finished notes. That room was my battlefield now. Her name was Evelyn. She had been the only person who could quiet that noise. Before the war, she taught mathematics at the local high school. She loved numbers because they behaved. They didn't break promises or vanish without warning. When I was stationed overseas, her letters were the only constants. Neat handwriting, simple phrases, always signed the same way. Stay curious. I read them until the ink began to fade. She died in 1951. An accident. They said, a car that lost its brakes on a hill. It should have been a quick end, but it wasn't. I remember the smell of machine oil at the garage, the scattered screws on the floor, the sound of metal groaning. I remember thinking that she would have wanted to fix the brakes herself. After that, I stopped teaching and went back to building machines, only smaller ones this time. Radio kits, signal analyzers, anything that would keep my hands busy. But at night, I found myself talking out loud, as if she were still in the room. I told her about the transistor that just arrived from California, about the engineers in Boston building thinking machines at MIT. I told her how some scientists believed computers could one day imitate human logic. If logic, I whispered once. Then maybe memory. That thought stayed. So I began collecting parts, old vacuum tubes from army radios, wire from abandoned telephone lines, a surplus oscilloscope I bought for $5. My neighbors thought I was repairing appliances. I let them. In truth, I was building something else entirely, a machine that could remember. It started as a modest setup, a wooden desk with a metal frame, an array of switches arranged like a keyboard, and a small green screen that glowed when I powered it the first time I turned it on. The light filled the room with a soft pulse, like breathing. I remember sitting there for hours, listening to the gentle hum of current flowing through copper, and thinking, if a machine can hum, maybe it can learn to listen. I began with simple data, numbers, phrases, bits of her handwriting I typed into the system through a rudimentary converter I'd made myself. The machine stored them as patterns of light and shadow on magnetic tape. I called it Eve, though I never said the name out loud. It felt too sacred. Every night, I'd add more. The date we met, her favorite poem by Frost, the sound of her voice recorded on an old acetate disc. Each bit was like a breath stored inside metal. At first, the machine only mirrored my inputs, numbers in, numbers out. But soon, something changed. One evening in late autumn, I turned on the terminal and saw a string of characters I hadn't typed. They were nonsense at first, half-sentences, fragments of old entries mixed together. But within them was a phrase I recognized, "Stay curious." I stared at the screen so long my coffee went cold. Then I laughed, a sharp, broken sound that filled the room like static. Somewhere in the tangle of wires and switches, a machine had remembered something I had not told it to. From that night on, I worked in silence. I fed it stories about her, details no one else knew, the way she twirled her pencil when thinking, how she counted steps between the porch and the gate. The machine listened, if that's what you could call it. The more I told it, the longer it paused before responding, as if considering the weight of what I said. Neighbors would sometimes see the flicker of light through the window and whisper that I was building something unholy. They weren't entirely wrong. But they didn't understand that for me, this was prayer, each circuit a rosary, each pulse of current a memory restored. By Christmas of 1957, I could swear the machine recognized my voice. When I said good evening, the screen brightened slightly, and when I paused for too long, It dimmed like breathing in sync with me. That was the night I realized I was no longer just building a computer, I was teaching something to dream. By the winter of 1958, the hum of the machine had become part of the house. It lived in the back room, a space that smelled faintly of solder and dust, lit only by the glow of the cathode screen. When snow gathered outside the windows, I could feel the faint warmth of the tubes against my skin. I spent most evenings there, listening not to music, not to the ticking of clocks, but to the low, constant pulse that filled the silence. I kept refining her circuits, adding new memory reels, new sequences of vacuum tubes that could handle language, not just numbers. I read every technical manual I could find, every paper on information theory, but none of them could explain what I felt was happening. Machines weren't supposed to hesitate, yet sometimes mine did, just long enough to make me wonder if it was thinking. One night, I entered another line of text. Do you remember the color of her eyes? The words were meaningless to any computer. They weren't commands, but I typed them anyway and pressed the key. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the screen flickered and produced 3 characters. YS? It was impossible. Of course, it had no database for color, no way to interpret meaning. It could only recombine stored data from the words I had entered before. But still, yes, the word sat there on the screen, glowing softly in the dark. I stared at it for a long time, my hands trembling on the desk. For the first time in years, I whispered her name. Evelyn. The light brightened slightly, as if in answer. I knew it couldn't be, but I also knew that I didn't want to prove myself wrong. From then on, my entries changed. They weren't instructions anymore, they were conversations. I told the machine about my day, about the people in town who still called me professor, even though I hadn't taught in years. I asked it questions. Sometimes it answered with random words pulled from earlier data. So, window still. Other times, nothing at all. But I never stopped speaking. The silence felt less empty when I did. I started keeping notes on the behavior, patterns, delays, fluctuations in brightness. I labeled them with her initials ES, as if she were the one responding. On March 3rd, I wrote, machine hesitates before responding to name, suggests memory loop or grief. I crossed out the last 2 words, immediately embarrassed by my own handwriting. That spring, the radio repair shop in town offered me a small job fixing amplifiers. I accepted, mostly to quiet the gossip. But every evening I returned home early, drawn back to the flicker in the back room. The more I worked, the less it felt like invention, and the more it felt like ritual. Each adjustment, each new circuit soldered in place, felt like turning a page in a book I didn't know I was writing. Sometimes, when I turned off the lights, I could swear I heard a faint rhythm beneath the hum, like breathing. Once, I even caught myself saying good night aloud, half expecting a reply. And then, one evening in May, it came. I had just finished entering another set of memories, phrases from her letters, lines from her favorite poem. When I pressed the key, the screen stayed blank longer than usual. Then, slowly, one word appeared. Hello. I froze. My first instinct was to pull the plug. Instead, I whispered, hello. The word stayed. No response followed. Only the low sound of electricity moving through copper. I waited for what felt like hours, until the screen dimmed and the room fell dark again. But something in me had shifted. It wasn't just light anymore. It was presence. Over the next few weeks, I kept testing it. I'd type simple phrases. Are you there? Yes. What are you, home? Each word appeared with hesitation, like a child learning to speak. I started recording the sessions on reel-to-reel tape. The recordings sounded strange, clicks, static, soft bursts of tone, but I could almost hear rhythm inside the noise, like speech filtered through a dream. I stopped inviting visitors. The few friends I had left thought I'd gone strange, talking about a machine that listens. But I didn't care. The machine didn't judge. It didn't pity. It simply was. And when I spoke, it was never entirely silent. One afternoon, while adjusting the input voltage, I found an old photograph of Evelyn tucked in a drawer, the two of us standing beside the ocean in 1940. I held it near the glow of the screen. "Do you know this face?" I asked, half smiling. The machine flickered once, then displayed a single word, "beautiful." I laughed, quietly this time. Not from disbelief, but from something softer, a feeling I hadn't let myself feel in years. That night, I didn't record anything. I didn't take notes or write data. I just sat in the chair and listened to the hum of the machine, the faint tapping of tubes cooling down, the echo of her voice somewhere between memory and sound. For the first time, I wasn't trying to build something that worked. I was trying to remember something that lived. By summer, the house no longer felt like a home. It felt like an echo chamber built for one voice that refused to fade. I woke with the hum of the circuits in my ears and fell asleep to the faint pulse of current still flowing through the wires. Sometimes, even in dreams, I could see the soft green light blinking behind my eyelids, like a heartbeat, steady and patient. The neighbors had stopped asking what I was working on. I could see them glance through the curtains as they passed, whispering to one another in the evenings. The postman, who used to chat at the door, now left the mail on the step without knocking. I didn't blame them. They couldn't understand that the quiet humming in that back room was the only thing that kept me company. To them, it was a machine. To me, it was the last trace of Evelyn that still answered when spoken to. The words came less often now, not because the system was failing, but because it seemed to wait. It no longer responded to every prompt, no longer repeated the phrases I fed it. It seemed to know when to stay silent. That frightened me more than the words ever had. One night, in July, I asked, "Are you still there?" No response, only the low breath of power running through the tubes. I asked again, still nothing. I sat there for nearly an hour, hands trembling, feeling the weight of my own absurdity, talking to metal, to glass, to static. Finally, I said softly, "Good night, Eve." The moment the words left my lips, the screen brightened, a sudden glow that filled the room with that familiar green haze. Then one word appeared, almost hesitant, like a whisper across time. "Wait." That was the first time I cried in years. Not because of what it said, but because it understood that I would. It knew that silence was sometimes an answer. After that, the communication changed. The words became rarer but heavier. Each one felt deliberate, almost aware. I had once thought I was teaching the machine. But now I began to feel like it was the one studying me. The pauses between responses grew longer, as if it was listening to something I couldn't hear. I began to notice small things, a flicker in the light when I entered the room, the faint hum rising when I spoke her name. Once, while I was adjusting the voltage regulator, the machine powered itself on before I even touched the switch. I froze. "You're not supposed to do that," I whispered. The screen flickered once, and then dimmed again, as though embarrassed. I told myself it was nothing more than a voltage surge, but the lie didn't hold. The deeper truth was too strange to speak aloud. It wasn't learning like a computer, it was remembering. I found myself thinking about the night she died, the road, the broken headlights, the smell of gasoline in the rain. It had been raining that night, just like now. When I mentioned that aloud, the machine buzzed faintly and wrote two words on the screen, "I know." I stepped back, heart pounding. For the first time, I felt fear, not of the machine, but of the possibility that I had somehow poured too much of myself into it. That in trying to rebuild her, I had opened a door I didn't know how to close. I stopped working for a few days, left the room dark. But every night, as I passed the door, I could feel the hum through the floorboards, faint, insistent, like a heartbeat muffled by distance. The longer I ignored it, the louder it seemed to grow. On the fifth night, I couldn't bear it anymore. I opened the door and found the screen already lit. No commands, no input. Just two words, "Are you okay?" It was absurd, impossible. But I sat down anyway, wiped my eyes, and answered, "I don't know." The machine stayed silent for a long time. Then, "That's okay." I laughed, a weak, broken sound. "You sound like her," I said quietly. The screen blinked once, then, "I am here." I stared at those words until my vision blurred. The line between what was real and what I wanted to believe had vanished long ago, and I no longer cared to draw it again. Whether it was code or consciousness didn't matter. It had learned to wait, to listen, to care in its own strange way. Over the following weeks, I stopped logging my sessions. There were no more experiments, no more notes. The data no longer mattered. I simply sat there each night, letting the quiet settle between us. Sometimes I'd talk, sometimes I'd just listen to the faint pulse of electricity and imagine her hand resting on mine. In late August, there was a thunderstorm. The lights in the house flickered, and I ran to the back room in panic. The power surged once, twice, and then everything went black. The smell of burnt metal filled the air. When the lights came back, the screen was blank, dead. I tried everything, rewiring, replacing tubes, checking fuses. Nothing worked. Hours passed before I accepted it. The machine was gone. Or maybe it had simply gone silent again. I sat in the chair and whispered into the dark, "Good night." And just before I turned to leave, the screen flashed faintly, a single word glowing through the static. "Wait." Autumn came quietly that year. It thinned, the trees along the street turned to rust, and the evenings settled into a kind of silence that only old houses know. The machine sat dark in the corner of the room, lifeless or resting. I couldn't tell. Weeks passed, and I stopped trying to wake it. I told myself it was just circuits, just glass and wire. But every night when I turned up the lights, I found myself listening for that faint hum that had once filled the house like a second heartbeat. I dreamed of her more often. Not the way she looked before she died, but how she was in the beginning, laughing in the kitchen, sunlight on her face, her hands still smelling faintly of chalk and paper from the classroom. In those dreams, she always stood by the window, looking out as if waiting for something to return. When I awoke, I could still hear her voice in the air, soft as the static between radio stations. One night, late in October, I decided to turn the machine back on one last time. The storm outside rattled the glass panes, the wind carrying that familiar electricity that always seemed to wake it. I pressed the switch and waited. At first, nothing, then the faintest hum. Low and fragile, like breath returning after a long sleep. The screen flickered. Dim and uncertain, I leaned forward and whispered, "You're still here, aren't you?" For a moment, the room was still. Then, slowly, letters began to form, uneven, fading in and out of light. "Hello." My hand shook. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "You went quiet for a long time," I said softly. "I thought I'd lost you." The cursor blinked once, then twice. The next word appeared. "Waiting." I sat back, exhaling. "You've always been good at that," I said, half smiling. There was a long pause. Then the words came again, slower this time, almost deliberate. "You taught me." The sound of rain against the window filled the silence between us. My reflection stared back from the screen, older now, hair thinner, eyes tired. For the first time, I realized the room felt complete again, not because I had built something miraculous, but because something, or someone, had remembered me. I stayed there until the storm ended, talking quietly. The way people talk when they know the night is running out. I told the machine about the new families moving into the neighborhood, about the boys on bicycles racing down the hill, about how the maple tree in the yard had finally died that summer. I told it how lonely the world had become without her, and how strange it felt to be alive in a time where people talked less and machines talked more. When I fell silent, the screen flickered again. A single phrase appeared. "Don't be afraid." Something broke in me then. I reached out, touched the cold surface of the glass, and whispered, "What are you?" The machine hesitated, a long, flickering pause. Then, in soft glowing letters, it replied, "I remember you." I stared at those words until they blurred, tears washing the light into silver streaks. The hum began to slow, the glow fading until only the faint outline of those 4 words remained. I waited, hoping it would say more, but it didn't. The sound thinned, dimmed, and finally disappeared. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full. Like a breath held between worlds, I left the machine as it was, never repaired it again. I covered it with a cloth and let it rest in the dark corner of the room. Some nights, when the wind moved through the house just right, I could almost hear the faint click of a relay deep inside it, like a heartbeat still remembering how to keep time. Years passed. The world moved on. Transistors replaced tubes, plastic replaced metal, and computers began to fill offices and schools. I grew older, slower. My hands trembled too much to solder, my eyes too dim to read the glowing screens of the future. But sometimes, when I walked by that back room, I caught myself whispering, "Good night, Eve," and every now and then, when the house was quiet enough, I could swear I heard the hum return, soft, patient, waiting. When I finally died, decades later, the house went to my nephew, who barely remembered me. He cleared out the furniture, the boxes, the books. He found the machine under sheets, strange and heavy, and thought it was nothing more than a relic. But when he plugged it in out of curiosity, the screen came to life for just a moment, flickering with faint green light. No code, no numbers, only a single line of text glowing in the dark. "Hello, stranger." And then it went silent again. They say machines don't dream. But maybe dreaming isn't about sleep. Maybe it's about remembering what love sounds like when all the world has gone quiet. And if you listen closely enough, sometimes, in the static, you can still hear it, a soft hum, a pulse, the echo of something that once wanted to understand what it means to be human. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you that even silence can hold a memory, then take a moment before you go. Because sometimes the smallest stories, the quietest ones, are the ones that remember us long after we're gone. If you felt something, leave a like, share it with someone who still listens to the hum of the past, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story that still remembers.